candles had barely been lit when Duke Alaric Verne walked out of his own wedding feast, leaving his bride sitting alone at the head table. Guests froze mid-conversation. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. Nobody dared speak, but everyone watched. Lady Seraphina Ashworth sat perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands folded on the white silk of her gown, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Only her eyes betrayed her, following the door through which her new husband had just disappeared. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. Alaric did not stop to grab a coat. He crossed the stone courtyard in long strides, his boots striking the ground with a fury he could not name. He was a duke. He had responsibilities, an estate, a title that stretched back 3 centuries, and now, a wife he barely knew. And yet none of that mattered to him in this moment. Only one thing mattered. He needed to see Isolde. The carriage ride to her cottage took 11 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Alaric stared out the window, watching the dark hedges blur past, rehearsing what he would say. He imagined Isolde crying, imagined her clutching his hands and begging him not to go through with the marriage, even though the marriage had already happened. He imagined comforting her, promising her that nothing between them would change, that the ceremony was empty, a piece of paper, a political necessity, nothing more. When the carriage stopped, he did not wait for the driver to open the door. He stepped down himself and walked to the small wooden door of the cottage, knocking twice before letting himself in, the way he always had. Isolde Marchetti was sitting by the fire, a cup of tea warming her hands. She looked up when he entered, and there was no surprise on her face. She had been expecting him. "You came," she said quietly. "Of course I came." Alaric crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Her fingers were cold, but they did not tremble. "Isolde, I know today was difficult. I know what it must have looked like, standing there while I married someone else. But nothing has changed between us. Nothing will change." Isolde studied his face for a long moment. There was something different in her eyes, something he could not quite place. Not sadness, not anger either. Something steadier than either of those. "Alaric," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." He nodded, though a small knot of unease had begun to form in his chest. "I have accepted a position in Caldermore," she said, "with the trading house there. I leave in 3 weeks." The words did not make sense to him at first. He blinked, certain he had misheard. "Caldermore is 400 miles from here." "Yes." "You cannot be serious. What about us? What about everything we have built together these past 3 years?" Isolde set her teacup down on the small table beside her chair, the porcelain clicking softly against wood. "We have not built anything, Alaric." "Not really. We have built a secret, a very well-kept secret, but a secret all the same. I have spent 3 years of my life waiting in this cottage for the hours you could spare me. I have watched you leave, every single time, to return to a world I am not permitted to enter. And today I watched you marry another woman in front of half the nobility of this country, and I sat here alone, exactly as I always do. I had no choice in the marriage. You know that. My father arranged it years ago, before I even knew you." "I know," Isolde said, and her voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I have always known. I am not accusing you of breaking a promise, because you never promised me anything you could actually give. That is precisely the problem." Alaric felt something cold settle into his stomach. "So this is punishment. You are leaving to punish me for marrying her." "No." Isolde shook her head firmly. "This has nothing to do with punishing you. This is about me choosing a life where I am not waiting in the shadows for someone who will always belong to someone else. I deserve more than borrowed evenings, Alaric. I deserve a life that is entirely my own, in the daylight, where I do not have to hide." He stood up abruptly, pacing toward the fireplace, his mind spinning. "You cannot simply decide this and expect me to accept it. We love each other." "I love the version of this that I imagined when I was younger, and foolish enough to believe circumstances would eventually change," Isolde said. "But circumstances did not change. You are married now, truly and completely married, in the eyes of your family, your title, and your country. There is no future here for me, only a smaller and smaller room to live in. Then leave the position. Stay. We will find a way." "There is no way, Alaric. And deep down, I think you already know that. Isolde rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shape of the hedges beyond the glass. I am not asking your permission. I have already accepted the position. My belongings are already being packed. I came to this decision weeks ago, long before your wedding date was set, though I admit the timing feels rather symbolic now. Alaric stared at her back, unable to fully process what he was hearing. In all the years he had known Isolde, she had never once spoken to him with such calm certainty. She had cried before, when he had to leave for long stretches of estate business. She had grown quiet and withdrawn during the months leading up to the wedding announcement. But this was different. This was not sorrow. This was resolve. You knew, he said slowly, before tonight, that you were leaving, and you let me marry her without saying a word. What would you have done if I had told you sooner? Would you have called off the wedding, defied your father, your family, the entire arrangement that has been in motion for a decade, or would you have simply asked me to wait a little longer, promised me things would change eventually, the way you have promised for 3 years? Alaric did not answer, because he did not have an answer, and they both knew it. Isolde turned back to face him, her expression softer now, though no less firm. I am not angry with you, Alaric. I want you to understand that. You did not create the world we live in, the one where a duke cannot simply marry the woman he loves if she was not born into the right family, but I refuse to spend the rest of my life as your secret. I have watched women grow old that way, waiting for men who never truly belonged to them. I will not become one of them. So that is it then. 3 years, ended over tea in a cottage. 3 years ended the moment you said your vows this afternoon, Isolde said quietly. I am simply the one brave enough to acknowledge it. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed. Alaric felt a strange mixture of anger, grief, and something else he could not name, something almost like respect, though he was not ready to admit that to himself. Where will you stay? In Caldermore, he finally asked, his voice quieter now. The trading house has arranged lodging for me. I will manage their correspondence and their accounts. It is honest work, and it is entirely mine. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time since he had arrived. I have never had something that was entirely mine before, Alaric. Not really. I find that I am looking forward to it. He wanted to argue further, to find some clever words that would make her stay, the way he had always found the right words before, but nothing came. For the first time since he had known her, Isolde Marchetti was not waiting for him to decide something for her. She had already decided for herself. I should go, he said finally, though his feet did not move. Yes, Isolde agreed. You have a wife waiting for you. A wife you left sitting alone at your own wedding feast, if I understand the timing correctly. Shame flickered across his face, quick and unwelcome. He had not thought of Serafina once since leaving the estate. Not truly. She had been an obstacle, an arrangement, a name attached to his title, rather than a person with her own thoughts and feelings. She does not need me, he said, somewhat defensively. The marriage is political. She understood that from the beginning. Perhaps, Isolde said, or perhaps she is sitting there right now, in a room full of strangers, wondering what kind of man she has just promised her life to. I would not know. I have never had the chance to speak with her. She paused, studying him carefully. Though I imagine, whatever she is feeling tonight, it is not so very different from what I felt these past 3 years. Her words landed with unexpected weight. Alaric opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, uncertain what he could possibly say that would not sound hollow. Goodbye, Alaric, Isolde said softly. I hope you find whatever it is you are truly searching for. I do not believe it was ever going to be found here, in this cottage, with me. He left without another word, because there was nothing left to say. The carriage ride back to the estate felt longer than the ride away from it had, though the distance was exactly the same. He stared out the window at the same dark hedges, but this time he saw nothing familiar in them at all. When he arrived back at the estate, the wedding feast had ended. Servants were clearing the long tables, extinguishing candles one by one along the hall. He asked where his wife had gone, and was told she had retired to her chambers nearly an hour ago, alone. Alaric stood in the empty hall for a long moment, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration he had barely attended, thinking about a woman who had just chosen her own future over him, and a wife he had abandoned without a single thought. For the first time in longer than he could remember, He did not know what to do next. He climbed the stairs slowly, his footsteps echoing against stone, and stopped outside the door to Serafina's chambers. Light still glowed faintly beneath it. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, his fingers hovering inches from the wood. Behind that door was a woman he had married that very afternoon and had not spoken to since the ceremony ended. A woman whose thoughts about tonight he could not begin to guess. A woman who, for all he knew, might be waiting on the other side of that door with far more composure than he currently possessed. He lowered his hand without knocking and stood there in the quiet hallway, caught somewhere between the life he had just lost and the one he had barely begun, uncertain which direction he was even facing anymore. Downstairs, a single lamp still burned in the library, and the household staff, gathered quietly in the servants' hall, whispered among themselves about what kind of morning tomorrow would bring for the new Duchess of Ashworth Hall. None of them had answers. Neither, it seemed, did the Duke himself. Morning arrived at Ashworth Hall with a pale gray light that softened the sharp edges of the previous night's events, though it did nothing to soften the tension that had settled between its two newest residents. Alaric woke early, having barely slept, his mind still replaying every word Isolde had spoken. He dressed without calling for his valet, wanting a few more minutes alone before he had to face the day, and the wife he had all but abandoned at their own celebration. He found Serafina in the breakfast room, already seated at the long table, a cup of tea in front of her, untouched. She wore a simple morning dress of pale blue, her dark hair pinned back neatly, and she looked up when he entered, with an expression that gave away nothing at all. "Good morning," she said, her voice even and pleasant, as though the previous evening had never happened. Alaric hesitated in the doorway, unsure how to proceed. He had braced himself for tears, for accusations, perhaps even for silence, heavy with resentment. He had not braced himself for calm civility. "Good morning," he replied, taking the seat across from her. A servant appeared silently to pour his tea, then withdrew just as quietly. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The clinking of porcelain and the soft crackle of the fire in the corner filled the space where conversation should have been. Finally, Alaric set down his cup. "About last night," he began. "There is no need to explain," Serafina said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "I understood the nature of our arrangement before I ever agreed to marry you. My father explained the situation quite clearly. This union exists to secure alliance between our families, nothing more. I did not expect romance, Your Grace, and I certainly did not expect explanations." Her words were measured, almost rehearsed, and yet there was something underneath them that Alaric could not quite identify. Not bitterness exactly, something closer to quiet resignation, carefully controlled. "Even so," he said, "it was not appropriate of me to leave the way I did. You deserved better treatment on your wedding day." Serafina's eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he saw something flicker there, quick and sharp, before it disappeared again behind her composed exterior. "Deserved," she repeated softly. "That is an interesting word to use, considering neither of us had much say in whether this marriage would happen at all." Alaric did not have a response for that. He studied her more closely than he had at any point during the wedding preparations, noticing details he had somehow overlooked before: the steadiness in her posture, the intelligence behind her eyes, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to managing difficult situations without complaint. "I intend to be a fair husband," he said finally, though even as he spoke the words, they felt inadequate. "Whatever else may be true between us, you will want for nothing. I will see to your comfort, your household, your standing in society." "How generous," Serafina said, and though her tone remained polite, there was an unmistakable edge beneath it now. "I am certain that arrangement will suit us both perfectly well, Your Grace." She rose from the table then, leaving her tea only half finished, and excused herself to attend to household matters, leaving Alaric alone in the breakfast room with his own thoughts, and the uncomfortable sense that he had somehow disappointed her further, despite his intentions. Over the following days, a pattern began to establish itself within the walls of Ashworth Hall. Alaric spent his mornings in the estate office, reviewing accounts and correspondence with his steward, an older man named Edmund Whitlock, who had served the Verne family for over 20 years. Serafina, meanwhile, took to exploring the house and its operations with a quiet thoroughness that surprised the staff, who had grown accustomed to duchesses who took little interest in matters below their own private chambers. "She has been asking questions about the kitchen budget," Edmund mentioned one afternoon, as he and Alaric reviewed a stack of ledgers. "And the tenant rents in the eastern village. Sharp questions, if I may say so." Alaric looked up from the papers in front of him. "What sort of questions?" She noticed the discrepancy in the harvest reports from 2 seasons past. "The one we assumed was simply a poor yield." Edmund adjusted his spectacles, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Turns out she suspected mismanagement by the previous overseer, and she was correct. Found the pattern herself, going through old records in the library 3 nights running." This information settled uneasily in Alaric's mind. He had assumed, without ever truly examining the assumption, that his new wife would occupy herself with needlework and social calls, content to leave the running of the estate entirely in his hands. The image of her sitting alone in the library late at night, poring over old ledgers by candlelight, did not match the picture he had formed of her. That evening, he found himself walking toward the library after supper, telling himself it was merely curiosity about the harvest discrepancy Edmund had mentioned. He found Serafina exactly where the steward had described, seated at a small writing desk near the tall windows, a stack of papers spread before her, and a single candle burning low. "Edmund tells me you found an error in the harvest accounts," Alaric said, standing in the doorway. Serafina glanced up, seemingly unsurprised by his presence. "Not an error. A theft, more accurately. The overseer at the time was recording lower yields than what was actually harvested, then selling the difference privately and pocketing the profit. It happened for at least 2 years before anyone noticed." "How did you notice it, when nobody else did?" "I compared the harvest records against the tenant payment records," she explained, gesturing toward the papers in front of her. "If yields were truly as low as reported, the tenants would not have been able to pay their rents in full, and yet they did, every single time. The numbers simply did not add up, once I looked closely enough." Alaric moved further into the room, drawn by an interest he had not expected to feel. "Why would you spend your evenings examining old harvest records? Surely there are more pleasant ways to occupy your time." Serafina set down her pen and regarded him with a level gaze. "Because this is my household now, whether either of us particularly wished for that arrangement or not. I intend to understand it fully, rather than simply occupying a decorative position within its walls. If I am to be the Duchess of Ashworth Hall, I would prefer to actually be useful." Her answer struck him as both refreshingly honest and slightly humbling. He thought of Isolde, and how their conversations had always centered around feelings, around stolen hours, and shared frustrations about circumstances neither of them could control. He had never once discussed harvest records or tenant accounts with her. He was not entirely certain Isolde would have found such matters interesting at all. "I will speak with Edmund about addressing the discrepancy properly," Alaric said, "and about compensating the tenants for any shortfall they may have suffered as a result of the overseer's dishonesty." "That would be the right course of action," Serafina agreed, a note of approval in her voice that pleased him more than he expected it to. Over the following week, Alaric found himself seeking her out with increasing frequency, using the excuse of estate matters to justify conversations that gradually stretched longer than strictly necessary. He discovered that Serafina possessed a sharp memory for detail, a genuine curiosity about the workings of the land and its people, and an opinion on nearly every subject he raised, delivered with a directness that few people in his life had ever offered him. She was not, he began to realize, simply enduring their marriage with quiet resignation. She was actively building something within it, brick by careful brick, whether or not he chose to participate. Yet despite these small moments of connection, an invisible wall remained between them, one that neither seemed willing to address directly. Serafina never asked about Isolde, though the entire household staff certainly knew of the affair, and gossip traveled quickly within manor walls. Alaric, for his part, avoided any mention of his former mistress, uncertain whether doing so would reopen a wound he had caused, or whether Serafina simply did not care enough about the matter to bring it up at all. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived at Ashworth Hall, bearing a seal Alaric did not immediately recognize. He opened it in the privacy of his study, and felt his stomach tighten as he read the elegant, familiar handwriting inside. It was from Isolde. She wrote that she had arrived safely in Caldermore, that her new position at the trading house suited her far better than she had anticipated, and that she had already begun making friends among her fellow clerks. She wrote of small daily details, the view from her new lodging window, the unfamiliar sound of the city at night, the strange freedom of answering to no one but herself. She did not ask him to write back. She did not express any lingering sadness about their parting. The letter read like something one might send to a distant acquaintance, polite and pleasant, utterly devoid of the passion that had once defined their years together. Alaric read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in a drawer of his desk. He sat for a long while afterward, staring at nothing in particular, trying to understand the strange hollow feeling settling in his chest. It was not quite grief. It was something closer to the realization that a chapter of his life had truly and completely closed, with a finality he had not expected to feel so soon. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Serafina stood in the doorway of his study, a ledger tucked under her arm. "I did not mean to intrude," she said, noticing his distracted expression. "I can return later, if this is not a convenient time." "No," Alaric said, straightening in his chair. "Please, come in. What did you need?" She entered and set the ledger on his desk, opening it to a marked page. "I have finished reviewing the Eastern tenant accounts. I believe we should reduce rents for the coming season, given the losses they suffered under the previous overseer. It would go a long way toward rebuilding trust with the tenant families." Alaric looked over the figures she had prepared, impressed despite himself by the thoroughness of her calculations. "This is well reasoned. I will approve it." Serafina nodded, then paused, studying him for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. "Are you well, Your Grace? You seem troubled this evening." He considered deflecting the question, offering some vague excuse about estate business weighing on his mind. But something about her direct gaze made him hesitate to lie outright. "I received a letter," he admitted, "from someone I once knew well. It reminded me that certain parts of my life have ended, whether I was fully prepared for that ending or not." Serafina's expression did not change, though something in her eyes softened slightly. "Endings are rarely comfortable, even when they are necessary. I hope, in time, you find that what comes after brings its own value." She left the study then, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving Alaric alone with the ledger, the folded letter in his drawer, and the growing suspicion that the wife he had married out of obligation might prove to be far more remarkable than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. 3 weeks after the wedding, word arrived that Alaric's mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, would be visiting Ashworth Hall for an extended stay. The news sent a ripple of nervous energy through the household staff, who scrambled to prepare rooms and menus to the exacting standards the Dowager Duchess was known for maintaining. Alaric, too, felt a familiar tightness settle across his shoulders at the announcement, though for different reasons entirely. Margaret Verne was not a woman known for warmth. She had arranged the marriage between her son and Serafina years before either of them had any say in the matter, valuing the political and financial benefits the union would bring to the Verne family far above any consideration of personal happiness. She had also, Alaric suspected, always known about Isolde, though the subject had never once been discussed openly between them. "Your mother arrives tomorrow," Serafina said, finding Alaric in the study that evening, reviewing correspondence. "The staff tells me she prefers the blue guest chambers, and that she takes her breakfast promptly at 8 each morning, with no exceptions." "That sounds like her," Alaric replied, a faint trace of dry amusement in his voice. "I should warn you, my mother can be quite direct in her opinions. She rarely holds back, regardless of whose feelings might be affected." "I appreciate the warning," Serafina said, "though I suspect I have encountered women of similarly strong opinions before. My own mother was not known for gentleness either." Alaric found himself smiling slightly at this, the first genuine smile he could recall in weeks. "Then perhaps you are better prepared for this visit than I am." The Dowager Duchess arrived precisely at noon the following day, sweeping into the entrance hall in a traveling gown of deep burgundy, followed by a small procession of trunks and attendants. She embraced her son briefly, then turned her sharp gaze toward Serafina, studying her new daughter-in-law with an expression that gave away nothing of her thoughts. "So," Margaret said, "you are the girl who married my son." "I am, Your Grace," Serafina replied, curtsying with practiced grace. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you." "We shall see about that," Margaret said, though there was no real malice in her tone. merely a habitual bluntness that seemed to be simply part of her character. She swept past them both toward the drawing room, calling over her shoulder for tea to be brought immediately. Over the following days, Margaret observed the household with the sharp, evaluating eye of someone accustomed to judging quality and competence in equal measure. She questioned the housekeeper about menu planning, inspected the state of the linen closets, and asked pointed questions about the harvest accounts that Alaric had recently corrected, questions that suggested she had already heard the full story from someone within the household. "I understand you discovered the overseer's dishonesty yourself," Margaret said one afternoon, addressing Serafina directly during tea in the drawing room. "Rather clever of you, catching what my son and his steward apparently overlooked for 2 full years." "I simply compared figures that did not align, Your Grace," Serafina replied modestly. "It required patience more than any particular cleverness." "Nonsense. Patience alone does not reveal fraud. It requires a mind capable of recognizing when something is amiss, even when everyone around you assumes all is well." Margaret set down her teacup, studying Serafina with renewed interest. "I confess, when this marriage was arranged, I expected a suitable political match and little else. I did not expect competence. I hope competence is not an unwelcome quality in a duchess," Serafina said carefully. "Quite the opposite," Margaret replied. "It is the most valuable quality a duchess can possess, though rarely the one anyone bothers to consider when arranging these matches." She turned her attention toward her son, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. "You would do well to recognize what you have been given here, Alaric, rather than mourning what circumstances denied you." The comment landed with unmistakable precision, and Alaric felt heat rise to his face, aware that his mother was referring, in her characteristically indirect manner, to Isolde. He glanced toward Serafina, uncertain how she would react to such a pointed reference to his former affair, made openly in her presence for the first time. Serafina's expression remained composed, though Alaric noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the comment had not gone unnoticed by her either. "If you will excuse me," Serafina said, rising gracefully from her seat. "I promised Edmund I would review the winter provisions inventory before supper." She left the drawing room with unhurried steps, and Alaric watched her go, aware that his mother's blunt words had touched a nerve he had not fully considered before. "You did not need to mention that," Alaric said once Serafina had left the room. "Someone needed to," Margaret replied, entirely unrepentant. "You have spent 3 weeks tiptoeing around your own marriage, as though it were a fragile thing that might shatter at the wrong word. Meanwhile, that young woman has been quietly rebuilding your household's finances, correcting fraud your steward missed, and enduring your obvious distraction with more grace than you deserve. At some point, Alaric, you will need to decide whether you intend to actually be her husband, or simply a man who shares her house and title." Her words stung, precisely because they carried the ring of truth. Alaric sat in silence for a long moment after his mother excused herself to rest before supper, turning the observation over in his mind. He thought of the letter from Isolde still sitting in his desk drawer, of the careful distance he had maintained from Serafina, despite the moments of genuine connection that had occasionally passed between them. He found her later that evening in the estate office, exactly where his mother's comment had suggested she would be, reviewing the winter provisions inventory by lamplight with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to every task. "I apologize for my mother's comment earlier," Alaric said, standing in the doorway. Serafina did not look up immediately from her papers. There is no need to apologize on her behalf. She spoke honestly, which is more than most people manage in this household. Even so, it was not her place to raise such a personal matter in front of you. Now Serafina did look up, setting down her pen and meeting his gaze directly. "Alaric, I have known about your former arrangement since before we were married. Your mother mentioning it openly changes nothing about what I already understood. What troubles me is not the mention itself, but the fact that we have spent 3 weeks together, sharing meals and conversations about estate matters, without ever once acknowledging it ourselves." Her honesty caught him off guard, though perhaps it should not have, given everything he had learned about her character since the wedding. "What would you have me say?" "I do not know," Serafina admitted. "Perhaps nothing needs saying at all. Perhaps we simply continue building whatever this marriage is becoming, one day at a time, without pretending the past does not exist, but also without allowing it to define everything that comes after." She paused, studying him carefully. I only wish to understand where I stand with you, Alaric. Whether I am a placeholder in your life, occupying space until circumstances allow you to pursue what you truly want, or whether you intend to actually build something real between us. The question hung in the air, honest and direct in a way few questions in his life had ever been. Alaric thought of Isolde's letter, of the finality in her words, of the strange hollow feeling he had carried since receiving it. He thought too of the past few weeks, the unexpected pleasure he had found in Serafina's company, in conversations about tenant welfare and harvest yields, that somehow felt more genuine than anything he had shared with Isolde in years. I do not have a complete answer for you tonight, he said honestly, but I can tell you that these past weeks have surprised me, in ways I did not anticipate when this marriage was first arranged. I would like the opportunity to discover what we might build together, if you are willing to grant me that opportunity. Serafina considered his words carefully, her expression thoughtful, rather than immediately trusting. I am willing to be patient, Alaric, but I will not wait indefinitely for you to decide whether I am worth the effort. I have my own value, with or without your recognition of it. I am beginning to understand that, Alaric said quietly, more clearly with each passing day. Later that night, after his mother had retired and the household had grown quiet, Alaric returned to his study and opened the desk drawer where Isolde's letter still remained folded neatly beside his correspondence. He read it once more, slowly, then walked to the fireplace and fed it carefully into the flames, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. It was not an act of anger or bitterness. It felt, instead, like closing a door gently, rather than slamming it shut, making room for whatever might come next in a life that suddenly felt far less certain and far more interesting than it had only weeks before. The Dowager Duchess extended her visit by another fortnight, claiming the roads were too muddy for comfortable travel, though Alaric suspected her true reason had more to do with observing the slow transformation taking place within her son's marriage. She said nothing further about Isolde, seeming satisfied that her earlier comment had achieved its intended effect, but she watched Alaric and Serafina with keen interest during every shared meal and evening gathering. One rainy afternoon, while Margaret rested in her chambers and Alaric attended to correspondence with visiting merchants, Serafina found herself alone in the East Wing library, a part of the house she had not yet fully explored. Tall shelves stretched toward the ceiling, filled with volumes that appeared largely untouched, their spines still crisp despite their age. She ran her fingers along the titles, curious about what interests the Verne family had accumulated over generations. A particular section near the far window caught her attention, filled with ledgers and journals far older than the recent estate records she had been reviewing. She pulled one down, its leather binding cracked with age, and discovered it contained detailed notes about the estate's original land agreements, dating back nearly a century. As she read through the yellowed pages, she began noticing something troubling. According to these older records, several parcels of land currently claimed by the Verne estate had originally belonged to independent tenant families, granted to the dukedom under circumstances the records described only vaguely as settlement of outstanding obligations. The wording felt evasive, almost deliberately obscured. Intrigued and slightly unsettled, Serafina spent the remainder of the afternoon cross-referencing these older documents against the current tenant agreements Edmund maintained in his office. The patterns she uncovered troubled her further. Several families currently paying rent to the estate for land they farmed appeared, according to the century-old records, to have been the original rightful owners of that very land, before some manner of dispute had transferred ownership to the Verne family generations earlier. She brought her findings to Alaric that evening, spreading the old ledgers alongside current records on his study desk. I do not fully understand what I am looking at, she admitted, but something about these old land transfers troubles me. The language is vague in ways that suggest whoever recorded these transactions did not want the details examined too closely. Alaric studied the documents she had gathered, his brow furrowing as he read through the old entries himself. This predates my grandfather's time as Duke. I confess I have never examined estate history this far back. Perhaps it would be worth understanding fully, Serafina suggested. If there is truth to what these records suggest, some of our current tenants may be paying rent on land that was never rightfully claimed by your family in the first place. The implication was significant, and Alaric recognized immediately the delicate nature of what she was proposing. Correcting such a historical wrong, if it existed, could mean surrendering valuable land and income the estate had relied upon for generations. It could also mean confronting uncomfortable truths about how his own ancestors had built the fortune he now inherited. "This will require careful investigation," he said finally. "I do not wish to make accusations against my own family, based on incomplete records, but neither do I wish to ignore genuine wrongdoing, simply because acknowledging it proves inconvenient." Over the following days, Alaric and Serafina worked together closely, examining every surviving document related to the questionable land transfers. Edmund joined their efforts, contributing his considerable knowledge of estate history and legal procedure. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that confirmed Serafina's initial suspicions. Nearly 80 years earlier, during a period of severe famine, several tenant families had fallen behind on payments owed to the previous duke. Rather than showing leniency, as many neighboring estates had done during that difficult period, the duke at that time had used the outstanding debts as justification to claim the family's land outright, forcing them into tenancy on property that had previously belonged to them. "This is troubling," Alaric said, once the full picture had become clear. "My great-grandfather essentially seized land from families already suffering during a period of hardship, using debt as a pretext for what amounts to little more than theft. The question now," Serafina said gently, "is what you intend to do with this knowledge, now that you possess it." Alaric considered the question carefully. He knew that correcting the historical wrong would mean financial sacrifice, surrendering land, and rental income his family had relied upon for generations. He also knew, with growing certainty, that continuing to profit from an injustice he now clearly understood would sit uneasily with him for the rest of his life. "I intend to return the land to the descendants of the families it was taken from," he said finally. "Where those families can be identified and located at least. It will mean financial loss for the estate, but it is the right course of action." Serafina's expression showed genuine approval, warmer than any reaction she had offered him since their wedding. "That is a significant decision, Alaric. Not every man in your position would choose to sacrifice wealth for the sake of correcting a wrong committed by his ancestors, particularly one that would remain hidden if not for a chance discovery in an old library." "Perhaps," Alaric said, "but I find I would rather build my legacy on honest foundations, even if those foundations prove smaller than what I inherited." Over the following weeks, Edmund worked diligently to trace the descendants of the affected families, many of whom still lived in the surrounding villages, working as tenants on land that had once belonged to their own ancestors. The process required careful legal navigation, extensive documentation, and no small amount of diplomatic sensitivity, given the potential for the revelation to cause significant upset within the local community. When word finally spread through the tenant villages about the Duke's intention to return the disputed land, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief, followed swiftly by cautious gratitude. Families who had farmed the same fields for generations, paying rent on land they had never known, once belonged to their own bloodline, found themselves suddenly restored to ownership of property they had long assumed forever lost. An elderly tenant farmer named Oswald Bramwell, whose family had worked one of the largest disputed parcels for 3 generations, came personally to Ashworth Hall to express his gratitude, standing awkwardly in the grand entrance hall with his cap clutched nervously in weathered hands. "I never thought I would live to see this day, Your Grace," Oswald said, his voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather used to speak of the land his family lost, though none of us ever believed anything could be done about it after all this time." "The wrong was committed by my own ancestor," Alaric replied. "Seems only right that it should be corrected by his descendant, however many years have passed." Word of the Duke's decision spread beyond the immediate tenant community, reaching the ears of neighboring nobility, who reacted with a mixture of admiration and quiet concern that such precedent might encourage similar demands from tenants on their own estates. Alaric found himself the subject of considerable discussion throughout the county, though he paid little attention to the gossip, focused instead on completing the process he and Serafina had begun. Throughout this period, Alaric noticed a subtle shift in how the household staff regarded Serafina, and in how she carried herself within the walls of Ashworth Hall. She was no longer simply the new Duchess, arranged into her position through political necessity. She had become someone whose judgment mattered, whose insight had uncovered a genuine wrong and set in motion its correction. The staff's respect for her deepened visibly, and Alaric found his own admiration growing alongside it. One evening, as the land restoration process neared completion, Alaric found Serafina in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet above the eastern hills. "I wanted to thank you," he said, joining her by the low stone wall that bordered the garden's edge. "If you had not found those old ledgers, this wrong would have remained hidden indefinitely, and I would have continued benefiting from an injustice without ever knowing its true extent." "You are the one who chose to act on what I discovered," Serafina replied. "Many men in your position would have found reasons to bury the discovery instead, preserving their wealth over their conscience. That choice belonged entirely to you." "Perhaps," Alaric said, "but I would not have made it without your influence. These past weeks have shown me a version of partnership I did not expect when this marriage was first arranged. You have made me a better custodian of this estate than I would have been alone." Serafina turned to face him fully, the fading light catching the thoughtful expression in her eyes. "I find myself grateful for that too, Alaric. Though I admit, when I first arrived at Ashworth Hall, I expected to spend my days managing household affairs, while you attended to matters that excluded me entirely. This has proven rather different from what I anticipated. Different in a welcome way, I hope." A small smile touched her lips, genuine and unguarded, in a way he had not yet seen from her. "Yes," she said quietly. "Different in a welcome way indeed." They stood together by the garden wall, as the sun disappeared fully behind the hills, neither speaking further, but both aware that something between them had shifted meaningfully during the weeks since their wedding, growing into something neither of them had expected, yet both were beginning to value deeply. Autumn settled over Ashworth Hall, with crisp mornings and shortening days, and with it came the Harvest Festival, a tradition the estate had observed for generations, bringing together tenants, merchants, and household staff for a celebration marking the end of the growing season. This year, the festival carried added significance, given the recent land restorations and the goodwill they had generated throughout the surrounding villages. Serafina threw herself into the festival preparations with characteristic thoroughness, working alongside the housekeeper, Mrs. Beatrice Langley, to coordinate everything from the food arrangements to the entertainment planned for the village green. Alaric found himself drawn into the preparations as well, offering suggestions and occasionally simply enjoying the sight of his wife, directing activity with confident authority. "You seem to be enjoying this," he observed one afternoon, finding her in the great hall, overseeing the arrangement of long tables that would host the festival feast. "I have always enjoyed bringing people together," Serafina admitted, adjusting a stack of linens with practiced efficiency. "My childhood home held similar gatherings each autumn, though on a smaller scale than what Ashworth Hall can offer. There is something satisfying about seeing an entire community gathered in celebration, particularly after a year that held its share of difficulties." "The tenants have much to celebrate this year," Alaric agreed, "thanks in large part to your discovery." "Thanks to our shared decision," Serafina corrected gently. "I merely found the information. You chose what to do with it." The morning of the festival arrived bright and clear, unusually mild for the season, as though the weather itself wished to cooperate with the celebration. Villagers began arriving early, bringing baskets of preserved fruits, freshly baked bread, and small handmade gifts to exchange with neighbors. Musicians set up near the village green, tuning their instruments in preparation for the evening's dancing. Alaric and Serafina moved through the gathering together, greeting tenants and merchants alike, and Alaric found himself noticing how naturally his wife engaged with people from every level of society, showing genuine interest in their families, their concerns, and their small triumphs throughout the year. She remembered names easily, asked thoughtful questions, and listened with genuine attention, rather than the polite disinterest he had witnessed in many members of the nobility during similar gatherings throughout his life. The celebration continued through the afternoon and into the evening, with long tables groaning under the weight of harvest bounty, and laughter carrying across the green as musicians struck up lively tunes for dancing. Alaric found himself pulled into several dances by enthusiastic tenants who insisted their duke join the festivities properly, and he discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he enjoyed the experience far more than the formal balls he typically attended in aristocratic circles. As evening deepened and the festival began winding toward its conclusion, a commotion arose near the eastern edge of the village, where several cottages stood close to a grain storage building. Shouts of alarm carried across the green, and within moments, the unmistakable orange glow of fire became visible against the darkening sky. "Fire in the grain store," someone shouted, and immediately, the celebratory atmosphere shattered into urgent action. Villagers grabbed buckets and rushed toward the water pump near the village well, while others hurried to evacuate nearby cottages, uncertain how far the flames might spread. Alaric moved instinctively toward the chaos, shouting orders to organize the growing crowd into an effective bucket line, drawing on training he had received years earlier during militia service. But it was Serafina who moved with even greater purpose, rushing first toward the cottages nearest the fire, checking to ensure every family had safely evacuated before the flames could spread further. "There are children still inside," a frantic mother cried, pointing toward one of the threatened cottages. "My youngest was asleep when the fire started, and my husband is helping with the water line." Without hesitation, Serafina lifted her skirts and ran toward the cottage, disappearing through the low doorway. Before Alaric could call out a warning, smoke had begun curling from beneath the thatched roof, and the heat radiating from the nearby grain store fire made the air thick and difficult to breathe. Alaric's heart clenched with fear as he watched the doorway, seconds stretching into what felt like unbearable minutes, before Serafina finally emerged, carrying a small child in her arms, coughing from the smoke but otherwise unharmed. She handed the child to the waiting mother, then turned immediately to help direct the water bucket line, seemingly unfazed by the danger she had just faced. "Are you injured?" Alaric asked urgently, reaching her side and taking her by the shoulders, checking her for any sign of burns or harm. "I am perfectly well," Serafina assured him, though her voice was slightly hoarse from the smoke. "There was time enough to reach the child before the flames spread that far. We must focus on containing the fire before it threatens any other cottages." Her calm competence in the face of danger steadied the surrounding villagers, who redoubled their efforts at her direction, forming an efficient line to pass water buckets from the well toward the burning grain store. Within another hour, the fire had been successfully contained and extinguished, leaving the grain store partially damaged but the surrounding cottages entirely unharmed. As the immediate danger passed, and villagers began the exhausted process of assessing damage and comforting frightened children, Alaric found himself staring at his wife with an expression of profound admiration he had not fully allowed himself to feel until this moment. "You ran into a burning building without a second thought," he said quietly, once they had a moment of relative privacy near the edge of the gathering crowd. "There was a child inside," Serafina replied simply, as though the explanation required nothing further. "I could not stand by and do nothing while a life remained at risk." Many people would have hesitated, weighing their own safety against the danger involved. "Perhaps," Serafina acknowledged, "but hesitation costs time that a frightened child inside a burning building does not have to spare." She studied his expression, noticing something in his gaze she had not seen directed at her before. "Why do you look at me this way, Alaric?" He considered his answer carefully, aware that the moment held significance beyond the simple events of the evening. "I have spent these past weeks discovering qualities in you I did not expect when this marriage was first arranged. Tonight, watching you run toward danger without hesitation, to save a child you had never met before this festival, I find myself seeing you with new eyes entirely." Serafina's expression softened, the guarded composure she typically maintained giving way to something more vulnerable and genuine. "I have wondered, these past weeks, whether you would ever truly see me as myself, rather than simply as the arrangement your family orchestrated. Tonight, I believe, is the first time I have felt certain that you do." The remainder of the festival concluded quietly, with grateful villagers thanking their Duke and Duchess repeatedly for their assistance during the crisis, and the mother of the rescued child pressing Serafina's hands with tears of gratitude that needed no further words to convey their meaning. As they rode back toward Ashworth Hall in the carriage, the exhaustion of the evening finally settling over them both, Alaric reached across the small space between their seats and took Serafina's hand in his, an act he had never before initiated since their wedding day. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me tonight exactly who you truly are." Serafina did not withdraw her hand from his. Instead, she allowed her fingers to curl gently around his own, a small gesture that carried far more meaning than its simplicity might have suggested to an outside observer. "Perhaps," she said softly, watching the dark countryside pass by the carriage window. We are both only beginning to discover exactly who we might become together, given enough time and honest effort. The carriage continued its journey through the quiet autumn night, carrying two people who had entered their marriage as strangers, bound by political necessity, but who now found themselves, for the first time, beginning to glimpse the possibility of something considerably more meaningful growing steadily between them. News of the Harvest Festival fire and Serafina's brave rescue traveled quickly beyond the immediate tenant villages, reaching the wider circles of nobility throughout the county within days. At social gatherings and private dinners, the story grew with each retelling, and the Duchess of Ashworth Hall found herself unexpectedly celebrated as a figure of genuine courage, rather than merely another arranged bride within aristocratic circles. This newfound recognition brought both welcome attention and unwelcome complications. Invitations began arriving at Ashworth Hall with increasing frequency, as neighboring families sought to include the celebrated Duke and Duchess in their social gatherings, eager to associate themselves with the growing reputation the couple had built through their handling of both the land restoration and the festival fire. Among these invitations arrived one from Lord Edwin Ashford and his wife, hosting a substantial gathering at their estate to mark the autumn season, an event known throughout the county for gathering influential families from across the region. Alaric recognized the invitation as significant, representing an opportunity to strengthen alliances that would benefit the Verne family's standing for years to come. "We should attend," he told Serafina, reviewing the invitation over breakfast. "Lord Ashford holds considerable influence, and his gatherings typically include several families whose goodwill would benefit our own tenants and estate interests." "I have no objection to attending," Serafina replied, though something in her tone suggested mild hesitation. "Though I confess, large gatherings of this nature have never been my particular strength. I find genuine conversation easier than the careful performances such events typically require." "You handled yourself admirably during our own wedding celebration," Alaric pointed out, though even as he spoke, he recalled with some discomfort how he had abandoned that particular celebration entirely, leaving Serafina to manage its aftermath alone. "I managed," Serafina said simply, "because managing was required of me. That does not mean I found the experience particularly enjoyable." Despite her reservations, Serafina began preparing for the Ashford gathering with her characteristic thoroughness, selecting a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her dark hair beautifully, and reviewing correspondence to ensure she understood the various family connections and political sensitivities she might encounter during the evening. The Ashford estate proved even grander than Ashworth Hall, its ballroom, illuminated by hundreds of candles, reflecting off polished marble floors, while an orchestra played sophisticated pieces for the assembled guests. Alaric noticed Serafina's initial tension as they entered, though she carried herself with practiced composure, greeting their hosts and fellow guests with appropriate grace. As the evening progressed, word of the Harvest Festival fire had clearly preceded them, and several guests approached Serafina directly, eager to hear the story of her rescue firsthand. She recounted the events with characteristic modesty, deflecting excessive praise while answering questions honestly, gradually relaxing, as she realized the genuine admiration behind the curiosity. Among the guests circulating through the ballroom, Alaric noticed a woman he recognized from years past, Lady Charlotte Pemberton, whose family had long maintained friendly relations with the Verne estate. Charlotte approached them both with a warm smile, though her attention seemed particularly focused on Alaric. "It has been far too long since we last spoke properly, Alaric," Charlotte said, her hand resting briefly on his arm, in a gesture that lingered slightly longer than mere politeness required. "I understand congratulations are in order, both for your marriage and for the remarkable courage your new wife displayed during the recent festival fire." "Thank you, Charlotte," Alaric replied, gently extracting his arm from her touch, while maintaining polite courtesy. "Serafina, may I introduce Lady Charlotte Pemberton, an old family friend." "A pleasure to finally meet you," Serafina said, extending appropriate courtesy, despite something guarded entering her expression. "The pleasure is entirely mine," Charlotte replied smoothly. "I have heard so much about you these past weeks, though I confess, I was rather surprised when I learned of Alaric's marriage. We had always assumed his heart belonged elsewhere, given his rather well-known attachment to a certain young woman these past years." The comment landed with deliberate precision, and Alaric felt his jaw tighten at Charlotte's thinly veiled reference to Isolde, delivered with just enough plausible deniability to avoid outright rudeness, while still causing obvious discomfort. He glanced toward Serafina, uncertain how she would respond to such a pointed remark made publicly within the crowded ballroom. To his surprise, Serafina's expression remained perfectly composed, her smile never wavering, despite the obvious intent behind Charlotte's words. "Circumstances change, Lady Pemberton, as I am certain you understand. My husband has proven himself an excellent partner in managing our estate affairs, and I find myself quite satisfied with the marriage we have built together, regardless of what assumptions others may have held beforehand." Her calm confidence effectively deflated whatever satisfaction Charlotte had hoped to derive from the exchange, and after a moment of visible surprise, Charlotte offered a tight smile before excusing herself to greet other guests elsewhere in the ballroom. "I apologize for that exchange," Alaric said quietly, once Charlotte had moved beyond hearing distance. Charlotte has always enjoyed stirring discomfort where she can find opportunity for it. "There is no need to apologize," Serafina replied, though Alaric noticed a slight tension remaining in her shoulders despite her composed exterior. "Such comments will likely follow us for some time yet. Given the circumstances surrounding our marriage, I would rather address them directly than pretend they do not exist." They continued moving through the gathering, and as the evening progressed, Alaric found himself watching Serafina with growing appreciation for how she navigated the complex social currents surrounding them, deflecting pointed comments with grace, while building genuine connections with guests who approached her with sincere curiosity rather than deliberate provocation. Later in the evening, during a lull in the dancing, Alaric found himself alone briefly with Lord Ashford himself, an older gentleman known throughout the county for his shrewd political instincts and careful assessment of character. "Your wife has made quite an impression this evening," Lord Ashford observed, watching Serafina across the ballroom as she engaged in animated conversation with several other guests. "There is a substance to her that many young women in her position lack, having grown accustomed to arranged marriages as mere formalities rather than genuine partnerships." "I have been discovering that substance myself these past weeks," Alaric admitted, "rather later than I probably should have." "Better late recognition than none at all," Lord Ashford replied with a knowing smile. "I have observed many marriages within our social circles, Alaric, and I can tell you with some confidence that the ones built on genuine partnership, however delayed that partnership might be in developing, tend to weather difficulties far better than those maintained through mere obligation or convenience. Your wife strikes me as a woman worth genuine investment rather than simply tolerance." The observation stayed with Alaric throughout the remainder of the evening, and as their carriage finally departed the Ashford estate well past midnight, he found himself studying Serafina in the dim carriage light with renewed consideration. "You handled Charlotte's comment admirably tonight," he said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them during the ride. "I have grown accustomed to such comments since our marriage began," Serafina replied, though her tone carried a note of weariness she had not shown during the actual confrontation itself. "It grows tiresome, constantly proving myself worthy of a position I already occupy, by virtue of our marriage vows." "You need not prove anything to anyone," Alaric said firmly, "least of all to me." Serafina turned to study him in the dim light, something searching in her expression. "And yet, Alaric, I find myself wondering sometimes whether you have fully released the past yourself, or whether some part of you still measures our marriage against what you once shared with someone else." The question struck deeper than Charlotte's earlier provocation had managed, precisely because it came from genuine concern rather than deliberate mischief. Alaric considered his answer carefully, aware that honesty mattered more in this moment than comfortable reassurance. "I burned her letter weeks ago," he said quietly, "not out of anger, but because I recognized that chapter of my life had genuinely closed. What I am building with you now feels entirely different from what came before, Serafina. Not merely different in circumstance, but different in substance and depth." Serafina studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, before finally allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "I hope that proves true, Alaric, because I find myself, somewhat unexpectedly, genuinely invested in what we are building together, regardless of how this marriage began." "As am I," Alaric replied, and in the quiet darkness of the carriage, He reached for her hand once more, this time without hesitation. Feeling her fingers close around his own, with a warmth that suggested trust was, slowly, but genuinely, beginning to take root between them. Winter arrived at Ashworth Hall with heavy snowfall that blanketed the surrounding countryside, transforming the estate grounds into a landscape of quiet white beauty. With outdoor activities largely curtailed by the weather, Alaric and Serafina found themselves spending considerably more time together within the house itself, developing routines and shared interests that continued deepening the connection, first sparked during the autumn months. Alaric discovered that Serafina possessed a genuine talent for chess, a game she had learned from her father during childhood, and their evenings frequently found them seated across from each other near the study fireplace, engaged in matches that stretched late into the night, punctuated by conversation ranging from estate matters to their respective childhoods and personal histories. My father taught me this game, specifically because he believed strategic thinking would serve me well, regardless of what circumstances life eventually presented, Serafina explained one evening, studying the board carefully before moving her bishop into position. He always said that a woman who could think several moves ahead would never find herself entirely at the mercy of circumstances beyond her control. Your father sounds like a wise man, Alaric observed, considering his own next move with genuine concentration, having learned quickly that Serafina's skill at the game demanded his full attention if he hoped to avoid swift defeat. He was, Serafina agreed, a note of quiet affection entering her voice. He passed when I was 17, before he could see how this marriage arrangement would unfold. I sometimes wonder what he would have thought of you, Alaric, given everything that has transpired since our wedding. I would hope he might have approved, Alaric said, moving his knight into what he believed was a clever position, though Serafina's slight smile suggested she had already anticipated the move several turns earlier. Perhaps, she replied, capturing his knight with practiced efficiency, though I suspect he would have reserved final judgment until he witnessed how you treated me during difficulty, rather than simply during pleasant evenings such as this one. Her comment carried gentle weight, and Alaric found himself reflecting on how far their relationship had traveled since that first uncomfortable breakfast following their wedding night. The distance he had once maintained, born from confusion and lingering attachment to a life he had assumed would continue unchanged, had gradually given way to something considerably more genuine. As winter deepened, however, a new challenge arrived that would test the foundation they had been carefully building together. A severe fever began spreading through the tenant villages, striking particularly hard among children and the elderly, whose bodies proved less resilient against the illness's effects. Within 2 weeks, several deaths had occurred among the tenant population, and panic began spreading through the surrounding communities as families feared for their own safety. Edmund brought the troubling reports to Alaric's attention during a morning meeting in the estate office, his expression grave as he outlined the growing scope of the crisis. The physician from the nearby town reports the fever spreading faster than he can manage alone, Edmund explained. Several families have already lost children to the illness, and he fears the situation will worsen considerably before it improves, particularly given the harsh winter conditions, limiting movement and access to proper care. Alaric asked, already calculating what the estate might provide toward addressing the crisis. Medicine primarily, along with additional hands capable of providing basic nursing care to affected families. The physician cannot possibly attend to every case personally, given the number of villages affected across the estate. Serafina, who had been reviewing household accounts nearby during the conversation, set down her papers and joined the discussion with evident concern. I have some experience with nursing care, gained during my own childhood when illness swept through our household staff. I could organize volunteers among our own servants to assist the physician directly, provided we can secure adequate medicine and supplies. The risk of exposure would be significant, Alaric said, immediate concern for her safety rising despite his admiration for her willingness to help. This fever has already claimed several lives among the tenant population. I am aware of the risk, Serafina replied steadily, but I cannot in good conscience remain safely within these walls, while children in our care suffer without adequate assistance. If there is something meaningful I can do to help, I intend to do it, regardless of personal risk involved. Alaric recognized, even as concern for her well-being weighed heavily on his mind, that attempting to forbid her involvement would accomplish little beyond causing friction between them. and would fundamentally contradict everything he had come to admire about her character since their marriage began. "Then we shall organize this effort together," he said finally. "I will ride to town myself to secure whatever medicine can be obtained, while you coordinate volunteers here at the estate to prepare supplies and establish proper nursing protocols to minimize risk of further spread." Over the following days, Ashworth Hall transformed into a coordination center for fighting the spreading illness. Serafina organized household staff into shifts, ensuring proper hand-washing protocols and careful management of contaminated linens, drawing on knowledge she had absorbed during her own childhood experience with illness. Alaric personally oversaw the distribution of medicine and supplies throughout the affected villages, working alongside the overwhelmed physician to establish more efficient systems for treating the growing number of cases. The work proved exhausting and often heartbreaking, as despite their best efforts, several more families lost loved ones to the relentless fever. Serafina personally attended several deathbeds, offering what comfort she could to grieving families, her own composure occasionally cracking under the weight of witnessing such suffering, particularly among the youngest victims. One evening, after a particularly difficult day that had seen the loss of 2 young children within the same family, Alaric found Serafina alone in the estate chapel, sitting quietly in one of the wooden pews, her shoulders hunched with visible exhaustion and grief. "I could not save them," she said quietly, as Alaric took a seat beside her in the dim candlelight. "Despite everything we have done, despite all our efforts, some of these children simply could not be saved." "You have done everything within your power," Alaric said gently, resisting the urge to offer empty reassurance that might diminish the genuine grief she was experiencing. "The fever has proven more severe than anyone anticipated, and no amount of effort could have guaranteed different outcomes in every single case." "I know that, logically," Serafina replied, wiping at tears she had clearly been fighting to control. "But knowing something logically does not always ease the weight of watching a mother lose her child, despite everything we attempted to prevent it." Alaric reached for her hand, offering silent comfort rather than further words, and they sat together in the quiet chapel for a long while, allowing the weight of the difficult days to settle between them, without pretense or performance. "You have shown remarkable strength throughout this crisis," Alaric finally said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not merely in your willingness to face the danger involved, but in your ability to continue offering comfort and care, despite the genuine toll it has taken on you personally." "I could not have managed this alone," Serafina replied, turning to meet his gaze directly. "Your support throughout these difficult weeks has meant more to me than I can properly express, Alaric. We have faced this crisis together, as genuine partners, rather than as separate individuals, simply occupying the same household. That is precisely what I hope our marriage continues becoming," Alaric said softly. "A genuine partnership, built through shared effort and mutual respect, rather than mere obligation." As the weeks progressed, the fever gradually began losing its grip on the tenant population, thanks in large part to the tireless efforts Alaric and Serafina had coordinated throughout the crisis. The physician credited their organized response with saving considerably more lives than would have otherwise survived the outbreak, and grateful tenant families began referring to their Duke and Duchess with genuine warmth and respect that extended far beyond mere political deference. By the time the last traces of winter began giving way to early spring, Alaric found himself reflecting on how thoroughly his understanding of marriage, partnership, and genuine connection had transformed since that difficult wedding night, when he had abandoned his own celebration in favor of a woman who had already, unbeknownst to him, chosen to release him from her life entirely. The woman beside him now, exhausted from weeks of tireless service to their tenant community, bore little resemblance to the political arrangement he had once viewed with quiet resignation. She had become, through shared crisis and genuine partnership, someone he found himself increasingly unable to imagine his life without. Spring brought renewal to Ashworth Hall, both in the literal sense of budding trees and returning warmth, and in the more personal sense of a marriage that had steadily transformed from arranged obligation into something neither Alaric nor Serafina had anticipated when their union first began. Yet even as their partnership deepened, an unexpected complication arrived that would test the foundation they had carefully built together. A letter arrived from Caldermore, though this time it was not addressed to Alaric. Serafina received the correspondence directly, the seal unfamiliar to her, and she opened it in the privacy of her private sitting room, curious about its origin. The letter was from Isolde Marchetti. Serafina read through the elegant handwriting with growing surprise, her expression shifting through several emotions as she absorbed the contents. Isolde had written not to Alaric, but directly to her, explaining that she had learned, through mutual acquaintances within trading circles, of the couple's efforts during the recent fever outbreak, and of the land restoration Alaric had orchestrated for the tenant families. The letter expressed genuine admiration for what Serafina had apparently built within her marriage, along with something resembling an apology for any discomfort her presence in Alaric's past might have caused during the early days of their union. Isolde wrote candidly about her own new life in Caldermore, mentioning that she had recently become engaged to a fellow clerk at the trading house, a kind man named Frederick, who valued her intelligence and independence, rather than requiring her to remain hidden from public life. Serafina sat with the letter for a long while after finishing it, processing the unexpected correspondence, with mixed feelings she found difficult to fully untangle. She had never once discussed Isolde directly with Alaric, since that pointed comment from his mother months earlier, maintaining a careful distance from the subject that had allowed their relationship to develop without the shadow of that particular history looming too heavily over daily interactions. Now, holding this letter from the woman who had once occupied such significant space in her husband's life, Serafina found herself uncertain how to proceed. She could simply set the letter aside, never mentioning its arrival to Alaric, preserving the comfortable distance they had maintained regarding the subject. Or she could bring it to him directly, opening a conversation neither of them had yet fully addressed, despite the genuine intimacy that had grown between them over the preceding months. After careful consideration, Serafina decided honesty served their marriage better than continued avoidance, regardless of how uncomfortable the resulting conversation might prove. She found Alaric in the estate office that evening, reviewing spring planting schedules with Edmund, and waited until the steward had departed before approaching the subject directly. "I received a letter today," she said, setting the correspondence on his desk, "from Isolde Marchetti." Alaric's expression shifted immediately to surprise, then something more complicated, as he recognized the handwriting on the folded paper. "She wrote to you directly?" "She did. You may read it, if you wish. I do not believe its contents require any secrecy between us." Alaric picked up the letter and read through it slowly, his expression difficult to interpret as he absorbed its contents. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked toward Serafina with an expression of genuine consideration. "She is engaged to be married," he observed quietly. "Yes," Serafina replied, "to a man who apparently values her considerably, based on what she has written." "I am glad for her," Alaric said, and Serafina studied his expression carefully, searching for any sign that the news had disturbed him more deeply than his composed exterior suggested. "Truly glad, Serafina. Whatever we once shared belongs entirely to the past now. I find myself hoping genuinely for her happiness, without any lingering complication clouding that hope." "I believe you," Serafina said, and found that she meant it entirely. The months of shared partnership, of genuine care, demonstrated through both crisis and quiet daily moments, had built a foundation of trust she no longer felt compelled to question, at every unexpected reminder of what had come before their marriage began. "Why do you think she wrote to you directly, rather than to me?" Alaric asked, curious about the choice. Serafina considered the question thoughtfully before answering. Perhaps because she recognized that any lingering discomfort about the past belongs primarily between the two of us, rather than between her and you. By writing to me directly, acknowledging what I have built within this marriage, she offered a kind of closure that a letter to you alone could not have provided. "That seems remarkably generous of her," Alaric observed, "given the circumstances of how our arrangement ended." "Perhaps she has found her own peace with those circumstances," Serafina suggested, "much as we have found ours. People are capable of growth, Alaric, even from painful beginnings. It seems Isolde has discovered her own version of the happiness she once sought within a life that excluded her from full participation in your world." Alaric studied his wife for a long moment, appreciating anew the wisdom and generosity of spirit she consistently demonstrated, even regarding a subject that could easily have provoked jealousy or lingering resentment in someone less secure within their own marriage. "I find myself remarkably fortunate," he said quietly, that circumstances brought us together, despite how poorly I initially handled the beginning of our union. We have both grown considerably since that difficult wedding night, Serafina replied, a small smile touching her lips. I do not believe either of us remains entirely the same person we were when this marriage first began. No, Alaric agreed, reaching across the desk to take her hand in his own, a gesture that had become natural between them over the preceding months. I believe we have both become considerably better versions of ourselves through the partnership we have built together. That evening, as they retired to their private chambers, which they had gradually begun sharing more consistently as their relationship deepened beyond its initial political arrangement, Alaric found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey their marriage had taken since that first uncomfortable morning following the wedding. I want to write back to her, Serafina said, as they sat together near the fireplace in their shared sitting room, to offer my own congratulations on her engagement, and perhaps to assure her that whatever difficulty existed in the beginning has long since resolved into something genuinely positive. I think that would be a generous and appropriate response, Alaric agreed. Isolde deserves to know that her honesty, difficult as it must have been for both of us at the time, ultimately created space for something considerably more meaningful to develop within this household. Serafina composed her response over the following days, choosing her words carefully to convey both genuine well wishes for Isolde's future happiness and quiet acknowledgement of how thoroughly circumstances had transformed since that difficult beginning. She mentioned, briefly and without excessive detail, the partnership she and Alaric had built together, the land restoration project, the fever crisis they had weathered as a unified team, and the genuine affection that had grown steadily between them. When the letter departed for Caldermore, Serafina felt a quiet sense of closure settle over what had once felt like an unresolved thread within her marriage. The shadow of Isolde's presence, which had lingered uncertainly during those early uncomfortable weeks following the wedding, had finally, fully dissipated, replaced by mutual understanding and genuine goodwill, extending between all three individuals whose lives had once been complicated by circumstances none of them had fully chosen for themselves. As spring continued unfolding across the estate grounds, bringing new growth to fields that had weathered the difficult winter fever outbreak, Alaric and Serafina found their own partnership similarly flourishing, strengthened rather than weakened by the honest reckoning with their shared past that had finally, properly, taken place between them. As the first anniversary of their wedding approached, Alaric found himself increasingly preoccupied with a growing awareness that, despite the genuine progress their marriage had made, he had never once properly courted Serafina in the manner she truly deserved. Their relationship had developed through shared crisis, honest conversation, and mutual respect earned through difficult circumstances. But it had lacked the deliberate romantic pursuit that might have characterized a marriage begun under happier initial circumstances. This realization crystallized fully one afternoon, when Alaric overheard a conversation between two household maids, discussing the upcoming anniversary, with evident curiosity about how the Duke intended to mark the occasion. I do hope he plans something special, one maid remarked to the other, unaware their employer stood within earshot in the adjoining corridor. The Duchess has given so much to this household, and to him personally, without ever receiving the kind of courtship most young brides dream of experiencing. Her companion agreed readily. It seems unfair, somehow, that their marriage began under such difficult circumstances, with him running off to that other woman on their very wedding night, though I suppose things have improved considerably since then. Alaric moved away from the corridor before the maids noticed his presence, but their words lingered in his mind throughout the remainder of the day. They were correct, he realized, in their assessment of what his marriage had lacked from its very beginning. Serafina had built genuine partnership with him through sheer determination and character, without ever receiving the deliberate romantic attention and courtship that might have made those difficult early months considerably easier to bear. He resolved, in that moment, to properly court his own wife, however unusual such an endeavor might seem, given they had already been married for nearly a full year. Over the following weeks, Alaric began planning carefully, drawing on knowledge he had gathered about Serafina's genuine interests and preferences throughout their months together. He knew she found particular joy in early morning walks through the estate gardens, before the household staff began their daily activities. He knew she treasured quiet evenings of chess and conversation over elaborate social gatherings, and that she held genuine appreciation for gestures rooted in thoughtfulness, rather than mere extravagance. He began with small gestures, initially subtle enough that Serafina did not immediately recognize the deliberate pattern forming behind them. He arranged for fresh flowers from the garden to appear in her private sitting room each morning, selected specifically from varieties he had noticed her admiring during their walks together. He requested that the kitchen prepare her particular favorite dishes more frequently, having quietly gathered this information from careful observation over the preceding months, rather than direct inquiry. "You seem unusually attentive to small details lately," Serafina observed one morning, discovering a fresh arrangement of her favorite lavender blooms waiting on her breakfast table. "Is there a particular occasion I have overlooked?" "Perhaps I simply wish to demonstrate appreciation. For a wife I have come to value considerably more than I properly expressed during our earlier months together," Alaric replied, though he offered no further explanation regarding his true intentions. As the anniversary date drew nearer, Alaric expanded his efforts considerably. He arranged for a small orchestra to perform privately in the estate gardens one evening, recreating in miniature the kind of romantic gesture he suspected Serafina had never truly experienced during their initial courtship, given the entirely political nature of their arranged marriage. When Serafina discovered the musicians arranged discreetly among the garden hedges one evening, playing gentle melodies beneath a sky full of emerging stars, she turned to Alaric with genuine surprise evident in her expression. "What is the occasion for this?" she asked, as he offered his hand to guide her toward a small table set with candles and refreshments near the garden's central fountain. "I have been reflecting considerably on how our marriage began," Alaric explained, seating her carefully before taking his own place across the small table. "You deserved a proper courtship, Serafina, filled with genuine romantic attention and deliberate demonstration of my regard for you. Instead, you received a husband who abandoned his own wedding celebration, followed by months of careful, cautious rebuilding, rather than genuine pursuit." "Alaric," Serafina began, clearly moved by the unexpected gesture, "you need not feel obligated to recreate courtship rituals we missed at the beginning of our marriage. What we have built together feels genuine and complete, precisely because it emerged from honest partnership, rather than performed romance." "I understand that," Alaric replied, "and I value everything we have built together through honest partnership more than I can properly express. But I find myself wanting to give you this as well, Serafina. Not because our marriage requires it to feel legitimate, but because you deserve to know that I actively choose you, deliberately and completely, rather than simply having grown accustomed to circumstances that were initially arranged without either of our genuine input." Serafina's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion as she absorbed his words, and the small orchestra continued playing softly in the background, filling the garden with gentle music beneath the emerging stars. "These past months," Alaric continued, "watching you demonstrate courage during the festival fire, wisdom during the land restoration, compassion during the fever crisis, and genuine grace in every difficult circumstance we have faced together, I have come to understand that I am not merely tolerating an arranged marriage. I am genuinely, completely, in love with the woman I married, however unconventional the beginning of our story might have been." The words hung in the quiet evening air between them, carrying weight that neither of them had previously spoken aloud, despite the genuine affection that had clearly grown throughout their partnership. Serafina reached across the small table, taking his hand in both of hers, her expression radiant with an emotion she had carefully guarded since their difficult beginning. "I have loved you for some time now, Alaric," she admitted softly, "though I confess, I feared speaking such words aloud, uncertain whether you had fully released whatever remained of your feelings for the life you once expected to build with someone else." "That life belongs entirely to the past," Alaric assured her firmly. "What I have found with you, Serafina, feels considerably more genuine and complete than anything I previously believed myself capable of experiencing. I love you completely, without reservation or lingering comparison to what came before our marriage began." They remained in the garden long into the evening, the small orchestra eventually departing as the candles burned lower, leaving Alaric and Serafina alone beneath the stars, finally having spoken aloud the genuine depth of feeling that had grown steadily between them since that difficult wedding night nearly a year earlier. "I want our anniversary celebration to reflect what we have genuinely built together," Alaric said, as they finally rose to return toward the house. Not merely a private acknowledgement between the two of us, but a public celebration that demonstrates to our entire household, our tenants, and the wider community exactly how completely I value the partnership we have created. "What did you have in mind?" Serafina asked, curious about the direction his thoughts had taken. "A renewal of our vows," Alaric said, "conducted properly, with genuine intention and public declaration, rather than the political arrangement that characterized our original ceremony. I want the entire community to witness me choosing you fully and deliberately, this time with complete understanding of exactly who you are, rather than simply accepting an arrangement negotiated by our families years before we ever properly knew each other." Serafina's smile, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the garden trees, conveyed genuine joy that needed no further words to properly express. "I would treasure that, Alaric, more than I can properly convey." As they walked back toward Ashworth Hall together, hand in hand beneath the star-filled sky, both of them carried a shared understanding that the difficult beginning of their marriage, however painful it had initially proven, had ultimately given way to something far more genuine and enduring than either of them could have anticipated on that uncertain wedding night nearly a year before. Word of the planned vow renewal spread quickly throughout the county, generating considerable excitement among both the tenant community and the wider aristocratic circles who had followed the couple's remarkable journey over the preceding year with growing fascination. What had begun as a scandal, whispered about in hushed tones following that infamous wedding night when the Duke abandoned his own celebration, had transformed into something of a local legend, a story of genuine partnership emerging from unlikely and difficult beginnings. Preparations for the ceremony began weeks in advance, with Serafina personally overseeing many of the arrangements herself, wanting the celebration to authentically reflect the genuine partnership she and Alaric had built together, rather than the elaborate political spectacle their original wedding had represented. She insisted on including the tenant community directly in the planning, recognizing how significantly their support and shared experiences had shaped the marriage she now treasured completely. The Dowager Duchess Margaret returned to Ashworth Hall for the occasion, her sharp observational eye immediately noting the transformation that had occurred within her son's marriage since her previous visit. "I confess," Margaret said, finding Serafina reviewing final arrangements in the Great Hall, "when I first arranged this marriage, I expected political convenience at best, and considerable friction at worst, given your husband's rather well-known attachment to another woman at the time. I did not anticipate witnessing genuine love emerge from such unpromising circumstances." "Neither did I," Serafina admitted honestly. "That first morning after our wedding remains one of the more difficult mornings of my life, sitting alone at breakfast, uncertain what kind of marriage I had actually entered." "And yet look what you have built since," Margaret observed, gesturing toward the preparations surrounding them. "Land restored to families who had lost hope of ever reclaiming it. A tenant community that speaks of you both with genuine affection, rather than mere deference. A husband who has clearly transformed from a man simply enduring obligation into someone genuinely devoted to his wife. You accomplished this through patience, competence, and genuine character, Serafina, rather than through any romantic gesture Alaric might have initially offered." "We built it together," Serafina replied, "through honest partnership rather than either of us acting entirely alone." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That is precisely the foundation upon which lasting marriages are properly built, my dear. I am pleased to see my son finally recognized what he possessed, however much time it required for that recognition to fully develop." The morning of the vow renewal arrived bright and clear, considerably different in atmosphere from the tense, politically charged ceremony that had marked their original wedding a year earlier. Tenant families gathered alongside household staff and visiting nobility in the estate gardens, where a simple arch decorated with flowers Serafina had personally selected stood ready to host the renewed declaration of commitment between the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth Hall. As Alaric took his position beneath the flower-covered arch, watching Serafina approach from across the garden in a gown of soft ivory, considerably simpler than the elaborate wedding dress she had worn a year earlier, he felt none of the distraction and confusion that had plagued him during their original ceremony. His attention remained completely fixed on the woman approaching him, whose journey alongside him over the preceding year had transformed both of their lives so completely. When Serafina reached his side, taking his offered hands in her own, the officiant, a kind elderly clergyman who had served the estate for decades, began the ceremony with words considerably more personal than the formal declarations that had characterized their original vows. "A year ago," the clergyman said, addressing the assembled crowd, "these two individuals stood before their community, bound by arrangement rather than choice. Today, they stand before you again, having built something genuine through the trials and triumphs of the year now past, choosing each other completely and deliberately, with full understanding of exactly who they have each become." Alaric spoke first, his voice steady and genuine as he addressed Serafina directly, rather than reciting formal, impersonal vows. "A year ago, I failed you on our wedding night, choosing to pursue a past that no longer served either of us, rather than embracing the future that stood waiting before me. Since that difficult beginning, you have shown me courage during crisis, wisdom during difficulty, and grace throughout every challenge we have faced together. I choose you now, Serafina, completely and without reservation, understanding fully the remarkable woman you truly are." Tears glistened in Serafina's eyes as she absorbed his words, and when her turn came to speak, her voice carried steady conviction, despite the emotion clearly moving through her. "I entered this marriage prepared to endure an arrangement neither of us had chosen for ourselves," she said, uncertain whether genuine partnership could ever emerge from such unpromising circumstances. "Instead, I discovered a husband who chose, through honest effort and genuine growth, to become someone worthy of genuine love rather than mere tolerance. I choose you now, Alaric, not because circumstances arranged our union, but because I have witnessed your character fully, and find myself genuinely, completely devoted to the man you have become." As the clergymen pronounced their renewed commitment complete, the assembled crowd erupted into genuine celebration, considerably warmer and more heartfelt than the polite, politically motivated applause that had marked their original wedding ceremony. Tenant families who had benefited from the land restoration project cheered enthusiastically, while household staff who had witnessed the couple's genuine transformation throughout the preceding year shared knowing smiles among themselves. Oswald Bramwell, the elderly tenant farmer whose family had been among those to benefit from the returned land, approached the couple following the ceremony, his weathered face creased with genuine emotion. "I have witnessed many marriages within these lands over my lifetime, your graces," he said, "but I have rarely seen one built through such genuine partnership as what you two have created. Your tenants are fortunate indeed to be served by leaders who understand that true nobility comes through character and compassion, rather than merely through birth and title." "We are equally fortunate," Alaric replied, "to serve a community that has taught us both so much throughout this past year, about courage, resilience, and genuine partnership between people who choose to build something meaningful together." As the celebration continued throughout the afternoon, extending into evening festivities that echoed the harvest celebration, where Serafina had first demonstrated her genuine courage during the grain store fire, Alaric found himself reflecting on the remarkable transformation his life had undergone since that difficult wedding night nearly exactly a year before. He thought of Isolde, now happily settled in her own genuine partnership within Caldermore, and felt only genuine warmth toward the woman whose bold decision to release him from their secret arrangement had ultimately forced him to confront what genuine partnership truly required. Her courage in choosing her own authentic future, rather than continuing to accept a diminished role within his life, had inadvertently opened space for something considerably more meaningful to develop within his marriage. He thought too of his mother's blunt observations, of Edmund's steady support throughout their various estate challenges, and of the countless tenant families whose lives had been genuinely improved through the partnership he and Serafina had built together over the preceding year. But mostly, as the evening deepened and dancing began among the assembled guests beneath lanterns strung throughout the garden, Alaric found his attention returning repeatedly to Serafina herself, laughing genuinely as she danced with several enthusiastic tenant children who had claimed her attention throughout the celebration, her joy evident and completely authentic, in a way that filled him with profound gratitude for the journey their marriage had taken. When their dance finally came, Alaric pulled her close, moving together in rhythm with the music filling the garden air. "A year ago," he murmured, "I could not have imagined finding myself here, genuinely and completely in love with the woman I married, rather than simply enduring an arrangement neither of us had chosen." "And yet here we are," Serafina replied, resting her head against his shoulder, as they continued moving together, beneath the star-filled sky, having built something genuinely worth treasuring, through honest partnership, shared crisis, and gradual, authentic love, that grew from unlikely beginnings into something considerably stronger than either of us could have anticipated. As the celebration continued long into the night, with music and laughter filling the estate gardens that had witnessed both the couple's shared triumphs and their careful, gradual journey toward genuine partnership, Alaric and Serafina stood together, as living proof that even the most difficult beginnings could ultimately give way to something authentically beautiful, provided both individuals proved willing to choose honesty, courage, and genuine effort over mere convenience or comfortable resignation. Their story, once whispered about as scandal throughout the county, had transformed into something the entire community now spoke of with genuine admiration, a testament to the possibility that even arranged circumstances, however unpromising their beginnings, could ultimately blossom into something genuinely worth celebrating, when both individuals proved willing to do the difficult, honest work required to build authentic partnership together.